Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Lyons, a partner in Husch Blackwell's Food Systems Strategic Business Unit and a member of the Food Safety and Regulation Group. My practice focuses on the regulation of food, alcohol beverages, and agricultural commodities. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit them via the question box. We will try to answer all of the questions during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. A PDF of the presentation is available in the program folder. This program has been approved for legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast. For watching and for sharing. Towards the end of the program, be sure to complete your short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. Joining me today are Seth Mailhot and Leah Kaiser. As the leader of the firm's FDA group, Seth handles a broad array of matters involving FDA-regulated products and services. His expertise in this space is due to his time prior to his law practice at FDA, where he acted as a research scientist and investigator. As an environmental attorney with a master's in environmental ecology and energy, Leah is among those monitoring and researching legislation, counseling on compliance, and negotiating remedies on a wide variety of environmental issues. So today, as you all know, we're here to discuss the complexities as it relates to the regulation of PFAS, polyfluorinated and perfluorinated substances in food packaging. For those of you who have been following this issue closely like we have over the last several years, we've seen a major proliferation of these laws at the state level, banning in very different areas and different ways the use of them in food packaging and other food contact applications. For today's presentation, we're going to, since this is a two-part webinar, we will be presenting on issues covering, general overview of what PFAS is, how it is used in food packaging and packaging materials, the federal actions that are ongoing related to the regulation of PFAS, as well as state bans and their details and the implementation that has been going on since January 1. Our second series, which is on April 26th, will be covering additional compliance considerations as you begin to work through your compliance plans, if you have not already done so, and some tips and tricks about what we've learned over the last several months of compliance. Now I'll turn things over to Seth Mailhot.
Thanks, Emily. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. When we talk about PFAS, as Emily said, it's the common name for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's a class of over 9,000 human-made chemicals. There is a list that EPA has identified of these types of compounds that you can find on the link. Two of the more common chemicals that we find in PFAS are the PFOA and PFBA. The definition really is, characterized by at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom, but that's actually not the only definition that we've found. In fact, there's a number of competing definitions out there, and depending on which regulatory entity or agency you're looking at, you can find any type of definition for what's a PFAS. Some require at least one carbon atom that is bound to 3 fluorine atoms in a structure. Some require at least 3 or more carbons in a chain where there's fully fluorinated carbon. The characterizing by at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom is on the more inclusive side of the range, where you will find that it's more inclusive than some other definitions. And then, of course, even more inclusive are the definition that tries to sweep in all organofluorines, where it's like at least one fluorine atom should be, identified as a PFAS substance. So one of the key terms you need to figure out is, what context you're working with to understand what definition you need to deal with. And where regulatory authorities haven't thought that far ahead, you can at least think through, whether or not that's an angle to pursue. So there are two primary types when we're dealing with these. There's the long chains and short chains. And depending on which regulatory agency you're looking at, sometimes those enter into the analysis. In particular, FDA has spent time differentiating between long chains and short chains, which we'll explain later. So what are the characteristics of PFAS? Well, they're so useful because they're both hydrophobic and lipophobic. And hydrophobic means that it repels water, where, it's like wax, where water will bead up on the surface. Lipophobic is the same, except when we're talking about fats. So lipids or fats, will bead up and be repelled on the surface of a PFAS. There's a high resistance to degradation, which is why they've been coined forever chemicals, because they, are very resistant to being broken down. And because of that, they remain in the environment in their form for extended periods of time. They also have the ability to stick to various surfaces, which is why they're so useful in things like food packaging and use in cookware as a non-surface. So they were first invented in the 1930s, but really gained their prominence in the 50s. You see them used in textiles for water-resistant clothing. You see them used in nonstick cookware, as I mentioned before, because of their ability to repel water and fat. It keeps the surface smooth so you can cook on the surface without having food sticking. Firefighting foams are a large source of environmental PFAS contamination. There's also food packaging because of their lipophobic features. They're used in paper-based goods where you're packaging fatty types of foods. They were also used in photography, pesticides, as well as cosmetics and personal care products. When we talk about PFAS in food packaging, as I mentioned before, because of their lipophobic properties, they're really used mostly as roofing agents. We're talking about like fast food wrappers, pizza boxes, things like that. They're used in both paperboard, and molded fiber packaging, but they're also used in some foam packaging as well, where they're part of a plastic or wax coating. So the uses in food packaging are ubiquitous. So FDA allows the use of about 17 different PFAS formulations directly as a component into certain food packaging products. The categories for food contact are usually in nonstick cookware, food processing equipment such as gaskets or O-rings, processing aids, paperboard food packaging, which we talked about before, and as components of plastic coating in food packaging. Because of its wide-scale use and the fact that they don't break down naturally in the environment, they're present a significant environmental concern. Most people living in the United States, through some analysis that's been done, are shown to have at least some amount of PFAS in their blood. And these precursor compounds can also degrade over time into PFAS substances as well. So it's become a significant environmental concern.
So PFAS exposure occurs in a variety of ways, which is part of the reason it's been so difficult to mitigate and address PFAS exposure overall. So exposure can come from consuming food containing PFAS, drinking contaminated water, using products that contain PFAS, or even just breathing contaminated air. And since there are so many exposure routes, there are a number of different mitigation strategies that agencies have pursued thus far to try to address this exposure. So the first one is focused on reducing environmental contamination. So this has been primarily focused on drinking water in particular, but as you can see, PFAS contamination is already widespread in drinking water sources across the US. EPA has been studying a variety of remediation technologies, such as activated carbon, but remediation technologies are expensive and difficult to implement. States especially have been leading the push to regulate drinking water, and there are actually a number of states already that have set enforceable state-level drinking water limits. The next approach focuses on bans on manufacturing or required reporting, and we've seen a lot of movement in this area in particular. So for example, in January 2023, EPA proposed a new significant use rule that would prevent anyone from starting or resuming manufacturing, processing, or use of approximately 300 PFAS chemicals that have not been made or used for many years. This group is called inactive PFAS, and in order to be able to resume use of these, you'd have to complete an EPA review and do a risk determination as well. For reporting year 2022, there were 180 PFAS chemicals that were required for reporting under the toxic release inventory. EPA has also proposed a new rule under TSCA that would require entities that manufacture or import PFAS to electronically report information regarding PFAS uses, production volumes, disposal, exposure, and hazards. So as you can see, there's a lot of proposed rules and a lot of movement in these areas, but these bans and reporting requirements are often not comprehensive. As Seth mentioned, there are thousands of PFAS chemicals in existence, and they're continually developing more. So that makes regulating them on a chemical by chemical basis particularly a challenging endeavor. Our third strategy focuses on removing PFAS from consumer products. So this is going to be kind of the focus of our presentation today, but states have been leading the charge on this strategy, and it has become one of the easiest ways for either state or federal agencies to take action on PFAS because it doesn't face some of the limitations from the other strategies. So it's not limited by expensive remediation technologies or by individual chemical studies. With those strategies in mind, I'm going to talk about a couple of additional federal actions that EPA has taken thus far. So there are multiple federal agencies working on PFAS. The first is obviously EPA. We've mentioned some of the programs already, but I wanted to highlight a couple of additional initiatives that EPA is working on. Just recently, EPA announced a proposal to establish legally enforceable drinking water standards for 6 identified PFAS chemicals. So this proposed rule would require public water systems to monitor for these PFAS and notify the public of the levels, and then reduce the levels if they exceed the proposed standard. In December 2022, EPA issued guidance to states recommending that states use the most current sampling and analysis methods in their NPDES programs to enable them to identify known or suspected sources of PFAS and to take actions using their pretreatment and permitting authorities, so such as imposing technology-based limits on sources of PFAS discharge. Last summer, EPA also put forth a proposal to designate 2 of the most widely and commonly used PFAS chemicals as hazardous substances under CERCLA. And this would ensure that entities responsible for releases are also responsible for remediation. And then I mentioned the proposed rule under TSCA earlier. Then I'll turn it back over to you, Seth.
Yeah, no problem. did I go too far? There we go. Oops. All right. So FDA has been monitoring foods for presence of PFAS compounds as part of the total diet study. Now, they've found overall that very few samples have detectable PFAS and that the levels are pretty low. The study was targeted on seafood, however. The market phase out of certain short chain PFAS looked to specifically phase out the short chain PFAS. Those are with 7 or less carbons that contain the 6,2-fluoroalkyl alcohol. The main reason for that phase out was for safety concerns, and manufacturers agreed to voluntarily phase out those compounds in a 3-year process that began in January of 2021. In addition, the longer PFAS chains were targeted earlier on, and those are PFAS that contain 8 or more carbon atoms. That's where you see PFOA and PFOS. That market phase out, it happened prior, and that, as of November 2016, they're no longer being used in food contact applications. So the congressional actions, there's the Keep Food Containers Safe from PFAS Act of 2021, which was introduced in this 117th Congress. It wasn't adopted as a final bill, but was passed as an amendment to the FDA Safety and Landmark Advancements Act of 2022 in the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. Now we're going to switch over to Emily, who will talk about state regulation.
Yeah, so now we can get to the meat of the matter, right? So as of today, 11 states have officially passed legislation that address PFAS substances in food packaging and containers. You can see the list of them on the or on the slide. They all have variable dates of when they go into effect and when they may impact your products. And we'll go through that timeline a little bit later. As Seth indicated earlier, and Leah did as well, most of these laws are truly focused on where our highest use of PFAS is in food packaging applications. And that's in paper, paperboard, and plant-derived fiber packages. But there are several states that are also applying this ban to all food packaging because there is wide-scale use in plastic coatings as well as providing grease and water resistance for paper packaging. And this applies both to the sale and distribution and manufacturing of these packages, as well as finished products that are in packages that contain PFAS. So it impacts both food manufacturers, packaging distributors, packaging manufacturers, as well as the final retailer, both at a retail grocery store, convenience store, as well as restaurants, and impacts takeout containers as well. So these laws, as I stated, are focused on the manufacture, sale, or distribution of food packaging. And it's not focused just on any use of PFAS because of its variety of applications, but it's focused on the intentional use of PFAS in a food packaging application. And if you've worked in the food space for a while, this intentional use piece kind of is a little bit like whether or not you disclose an ingredient on a food label. If it's a processing aid, you would not disclose that ingredient. So similarly, these states look at whether or not a PFAS chemical needs, or whether or not a PFAS containing food package is regulated based on this deliberate use. And that it has still a specific characteristics, appearance, or quality, or, as we call a technical or functional effect in the finished food as we would do for ingredients. So very similarly, the states are looking at it there. In addition, some states, and primarily it is one state, California, is in addition to this banning of intentional use, they also have a maximum limit of PFAS that can be present in any food packaging, and that's 100 ppm. And this comes into play very importantly because of the ubiquitous environmental contaminant nature of PFAS, where some of your base materials, such as paper, and fiber-based materials, may have PFAS in it, kind of inherently or naturally because of its presence in the environment. Additionally, some states are focused on taking what I would call a much more nuanced approach, where they're evaluating and only banning PFAS when they have been able to identify safer alternatives to PFAS in a particular food packaging application. And we'll dig into that just a little bit later, but specifically Maine and Washington are taking that approach. As Seth indicated earlier, there are a large number of definitions as it relates to PFAS, and that is one thing that needs to be closely evaluated as you manage your supply chain for compliance with this. However, most of the states have followed a fairly broad definition of PFAS and look at a class of chemicals where there is at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom. So maybe not as narrow of a definition as any fluorinated carbon compound, but all fully fluorinated carbon atoms. And this can get a little complicated when you're having communications with your suppliers who may not necessarily have that technical detail or be operating under the same definition of PFAS as you are. And then, as mentioned earlier, PFAS as it relates to FDA and EPA regulation is much more on a chemical by chemical basis. The FDA food contact notifications are on specific chemicals, a large number of them. I believe there are approximately 11 different chemicals in like 30 different types of applications. But that's where you need to be careful of the definitions in each of these laws because they are a little bit different. Similarly, each of the laws apply to different types of food packaging. Now, we talked a little bit about, the focus on products primarily composed of plant and plant-based packaging or plant-based fibers. And states like Colorado, California, Hawaii, Maryland, New York, and Washington have taken this approach. New York and California specifically, those laws are currently in effect, so that is where the majority of compliance has focused thus far. However, other states are taking a much broader approach and applying to any material type that may be used for food packaging. So that would cover plastic and foam applications as well. Additionally, the types of products that are impacted can be different in various states. Some take a very narrow approach where it is only applicable to containers, such as the state of Vermont. But other states look at where there is direct food contact and have a very broad definition of what direct food contact would mean and cover things such as disposable gloves, cutlery, and other items where Maine is the one who has that extremely broad application. And others will include both packaging as well as packaging components. So things such as labels, seals, and liners will also be implicated in the law. So there's kind of not a one-size-fits-all approach if you're trying to do state-by-state compliance when it comes to these types of laws. But we'll talk about how to manage that in the next webinar or our recommended way that you should consider managing that. As it relates to the safer alternatives approach, which Washington and Maine have chosen to do, this is something that requires a state-led regulatory process where in those cases, the Department of Environmental Regulation within the two states are required to do an evaluation that one considers, are there safer alternatives that are even available for PFAS? Because PFAS has become a primary chemical of concern in food packaging only within the last 8 or so years, science is still kind of getting there as it relates to alternatives because of the specific applications that we use PFAS in and the characteristics that they provide to food packaging. So these evaluations require a review of less toxic chemicals as well as non-chemical alternatives. And less toxic chemicals means that it has to be less toxic based on the scientific data available when compared to PFAS, which again, depending on the toxicological evaluations you've conducted or the supplier of that packaging chemical have conducted, may be variable in nature. Additionally, the assessment, at least in Washington, needs to follow the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse guidance for risk assessments and alternative assessments. So there is a model that states are using to follow. Since this is not the first chemical ban and assessment that has happened in different applications. And then additionally, which is probably the best part about this more nuanced approach that Maine and Washington are taking, is that when they are evaluating these alternative chemicals, they also have to look at the hazards, the potential exposure, such as mitigation into food and whether or not there would be health impacts there, as well as the performance, cost, and even the availability within the state of that alternative. And Washington has taken this very nuanced approach already, identified a number of food packaging applications where PFAS is not allowed to be used anymore, and then also provided an evaluation of some of the alternatives that can be used or were identified in their analysis. Maine so far has not conducted this type of rulemaking. Therefore, while their PFAS ban is in effect as of today, it is not proactively banning any PFAS applications within the state because this state level evaluation has not occurred yet. Maine has actually issued a recent statement in light of Washington having conducted 2 safer alternative analyses, and it very clearly said that this application and their safer alternative analysis does not apply to Maine at this point in time, primarily because there has been no availability assessment done based on the availability of those particular items within the state of Maine or that could be coming into the state of Maine. So when you look at the more nuanced approach, Washington has identified these specific food packaging applications where they believe that there are suitable and safer alternatives for PFAS in them. And many of them are some of our common, other alternative types of packaging. So wax-coated wraps and liners are, preferable for sandwich and other wrap applications compared to ones covered in PFAS. They also look quite a bit at some of the clay-coated type of packaging applications, as well as looking at PLA, both foam and rigid PLA. But as Seth noted earlier, PFAS can be used as a coating in some of those substances. So you still have to make sure if you're providing one of these alternatives in the state that PFAS is also not intentionally used. Outside, not necessarily in Washington's sense, it is only focused on plant and plant-based product, or paperboard and plant fiber-based products. They also note that a number of reusable alternatives could be used. In those cases, that's primarily focused on, I would say, some of the flatware options that restaurants can use, especially since reusable food packaging is not necessarily something that is very commonly used outside of glass and aluminum, where we're able to recycle those packages. So as it relates to kind of enforcement and compliance of these laws, we've provided a timeline here that shows over the next 1.5 to 2 years, we'll be, struggling or dealing with compliance with these different laws. New York and California, as well as Washington's laws have already gone into effect. Washington, you'll note, is broken into 2 phases where a set of food packaging applications needed to be phased out by February 1st of this year, and the state of Washington requires another set in May 1st of next year. So of these, again, there's a little bit of time to comply. And in some cases, if you're not a nationwide retailer or distributor of products, you may be able to focus on a more regionally focused type of compliance approach. But for the most part, especially if you're launching nationwide products or a nationwide retailer, you're going to need to comply with all states all at the same time and, really back several months ago. And then these states, in addition to the effective dates, some of the states actually include fairly large monetary penalties for violations of the state law. They're listed specifically here and can range from $5,000 for a first violation up to $10,000 for each violation. Now, some of the states have not necessarily stated whether or not this is on a per package violation or if it's on a per shipment type of violation. And part of that is because they're still figuring out their compliance plans and enforcement plans as it relates to monitoring of these laws and really determining how they're going to be evaluating and determining whether or not companies have complied. It's unclear, I'll be honest, exactly how they're going to do this, whether they're going to be going out and taking, product samples from the market and starting to test food packaging where they believe there's higher uses of PFAS. So they may be targeting paper, paperboard, and plant fiber-based products first, and then move on to plastic packaging applications if that is covered by their law, like in Vermont and Minnesota, for example. But they may also be waiting until consumers complain. As we know, consumer litigation is really where we see a lot of the enforcement going on in the food space, whether it's label claims or presence of PFAS or any of those things. And we do know that several companies have actually been sued recently, both at the retail level as well as the manufacturer level for the food package, saying that this is a violation, not just of the state law, but also that a person was potentially injured under a tort theory regarding the presence of PFAS in the products. Some have also focused on a false advertising type issue where, they were deceived about the healthfulness of the product because of the presence of PFAS. So that's one thing to be aware of, depending on what level of the supply chain you are as it relates to selling directly to consumers, and that, we're looking at enforcement and watching for enforcement there as well. Those cases have only very recently been filed, and they've been filed in states where the PFAS laws are in effect. However, it's unclear exactly how those will be moved forward and what kind of reception courts will have to those. So it's another area that you kind of have to watch for, in addition to your state compliance plans. So looking forward, not to make things any more complicated than they already are, there are 8 additional states that are currently reviewing PFAS bans right now in the state legislatures, which, most recently have restarted their new legislative sessions. Those 8 states are listed there. We're obviously closely monitoring them, and it's something that we would highly recommend anybody on this webinar or that may be impacted by this monitoring as well, because it may be a new compliance challenge for you. If you're spared to begin with, you may be the target of this in the future. Additionally, the congressional bill that Seth mentioned earlier, the Keep Food Safe Containers from PFAS Act, has not yet been reintroduced into the 118th Congress yet, which is the Congress that just started in January 1. So we'll be watching to see if this gets addressed at the federal level, because our 50-state patchwork, as we learned over many, many years in the food space, just really does not work with our nationwide and global food system. Additionally, there are other state laws that are looking at banning PFAS. For example, Maine is actually broadly banning PFAS in all products. Doesn't matter whether it's food packaging, whether it's clothing, really anything as of 2030. And as of January 1 of this year, they actually require reporting by manufacturers of products that may be sold or distributed within the state of Maine to register with the state and report what products are manufactured and sold within the state that contain PFAS, which is part of their monitoring for the 2030 compliance date. changes may occur to that law since it is extremely broad, and that means it impacts everything and all of the applications that Seth discussed earlier of PFAS in consumer goods and non-consumer goods. But that is something to be watching for on the horizon as it relates to you and your potential products. And then additionally, other states are looking at more specific consumer goods in addition to PFAS instead of necessarily that broad all products. For example, California has introduced a bill that relates to cleaning products and their sale, manufacture, and distribution as well to prevent that sale within California and continue to protect their consumers. And another thing to consider is that PFAS is just one chemical of concern that is a focus, but states have been looking at and targeting a wide number of other common food packaging materials, including phthalates, which can make compliance a little difficult because phthalates are used in plastic products. So if your plan to comply with the PFAS law is to switch to, primarily plastic packages where you may have less of an issue as it relates to PFAS, you may have an issue with phthalates, which are a common plasticizer, some of which are allowed in food contact applications. So it can get a little complicated, and it's going to make some operating difficult in some states. And it's just definitely something to watch. But we hope that you'll be able to join us for our next webinar series where we really dig into some of the compliance issues related to this and how to manage it, since, just looking at this and hearing all this information, at least for me, I know when I started working on it initially was, fairly overwhelming just to think about how to manage this for either a single company, and depending on how your procurement systems work. Is it a centralized procurement system, or is it decentralized where you have different regions and markets who you have to educate and work with to ensure compliance with the products? So with that, we will take any questions that there may be from the audience. And I see a few have come in. The first one, Seth, you or I could probably handle. There's a question that says, on packaging made from PET, so PET, it's commonly, is it recommended we specify from our suppliers that they state in writing no PFAS was intentionally added in the manufacturing process?
I mean, if you're asking me, you need to have a pretty comprehensive compliance program, and you need to consider where your supplier is located. I mean, domestic suppliers are certainly better able to prepare for the types of inquiries that you would need to do to prove that type of statement in the supply agreement. Suppliers outside of the U.S., particularly those in China, you need to consider whether or not they're judgment proof in some way, because if there is a problem with the products that you're sourcing from those suppliers, what avenues do you have to get compensation if in fact this statement in writing isn't borne out by the products that they're supplying. So things like indemnification agreements are great, but if the company signing the indemnification agreement doesn't have any if you don't have enough leverage over that company, it's not going to be worth the paper it's printed on. But Emily, what do you think? I know you've dealt with this too.
Yeah, and we'll really dig into this quite a bit the next time, but that is one way that states are allowing those who are engaged in the sale, manufacture, and distribution in their states to have specific certifications that you can rely on from your immediate supplier regarding the presence of PFAS in products. Now, again, this says no PFAS was intentionally added in the manufacturing process. It's not just that it was intentionally added in the manufacturing process. You also have to think about its use, especially as it relates to California with that 100 ppm limit for both whether or not it was used, as well as whether or not the base material may have PFAS inside of it. Because that 100 ppm applies to products, packaging, food packaging across the board, again, in that paperboard, and fiber-based packaging. So that may work in some instances, but in many instances, especially if you're going for a nationwide compliance plan, may not work. But again, intentionally added or intentional use is a little bit different than whether or not there's a function in the finished food package product. As Seth mentioned earlier, PFAS can be used as a processing aid, primarily as an anti-slip agent. So it can be used for plastic films, as well as removal of food packaging from molds, in the production process. Those would not be intentionally added as it relates to the state definitions generally, because they do not have a technical effect or provide some kind of function to the food package. It is more just to remove or assist in the processing place. And that's what we would consider kind of a processing aid. So intentionally added, you would need to make sure would be defined very clearly so that your supplier actually understands what they're certifying to. And again, we'll discuss that more in depth later. So the other question is, which parties in the supply chain, manufacturer, distributor, reseller, retailer, are subject to the state and federal regulations and penalties? And I can take this one, and the answer is everybody is, depending on the type of law and how it's written. All of them focus on manufacturer, distributor, manufacturing, distribution, and selling. So all of those products, and it's not focused on just sales to consumer. It covers both B2B as well as B2C sales. Truly, who is the state going to potentially go after as it relates to enforcement? It's really going to depend on what kind of compliance information you have. Do you have certifications from your immediate supplier of that food package or that food in a PFAS-containing food package that said it did not contain PFAS and it met the legal requirements outlined in the state guidance related to certification statements? So in that case, say the investigation was done at the retail level, a state found PFAS, in a paperboard product that was direct food contact in the state of New York. They'll go to the retailer to conduct an investigation, ask for what they have done. Do they have evidence or a certification from the immediate supplier of that food that there is no PFAS in the product? And if that's the case, they will go back in the supply chain. And even if they don't have that, they can still go to that distributor depending on whether or not they distributed that product into the state themselves. So there are a wide number of places where really everyone in the supply chain is subject to these state regulations. And as it relates to federal regulation, if we get to a point where it is true, PFAS are a wide-scale ban, in the U.S. in food packaging applications, anybody who is engaged in manufacturing, distribution, would be, truly the focus of any FDA level enforcement. So feel free, we've got a couple more minutes if there are any other questions from anyone in the audience. We wanted to save ample time even on this background piece, just because we know some of the science and technical pieces can be pretty complicated. All right, well, seeing no new questions coming into the chat, Seth, as it relates to kind of monitoring these state laws, how do you recommend a company consider going through that?
Well, I mean, part of it is making sure that your suppliers are reliable. And, in some ways, you may want to consider using some of the tools that drug and device manufacturers have been using with potentially conducting audits of suppliers and, whether paper or physical audits. There are, in the federal context, when we're talking about FDA, you do have the ability to use letters of guarantee, but those won't work on the state enforcement side. So, looking at trying to do a comprehensive review, we're going to talk a bit in the next session about testing, but testing isn't always a silver bullet. You need to be sure that when you're doing this type of monitoring, that you're doing it in a way that is adequately monitoring your supply chains. So,
yeah,
hopefully that helps.
And I would say, as it relates to monitoring kind of the evolution of these laws and regulations at the state level, there are a number of, pieces of information available on the internet that help with tracking of this. I will say some of them have variable amounts of accurate information, and most of them are, kind of stagnant based on the time of when they were posted. So working with your partners, throughout the supply chain, both your suppliers, as well as any partners that you have assisting with environmental compliance, or any of your vendors or, consultants that work on these types of issues with you that may be able to help you monitor these types of issues. I'll always make a plug that your legal counsel can always help you do that. However, there are some publicly available resources that may help you get started as it relates to monitoring these things, especially if you're not used to monitoring state level legislation, which is much more difficult than federal legislation because you have 50 jurisdictions to monitor. Well, actually at least 51 plus any of the other territories of the US where you may be distributing products and these laws may pop up. It looks like we got another question in on the chat. And Seth, you can take this one first and I'll see if I can, do any batting cleanup on it. But how common are PFAS in products in use today? Do most food and beverage packaging contain PFAS that are or will be prohibited?
So if we're talking about the state level prohibitions, they are fairly extensively used. That's trending towards less use, but to be honest, the industry as a whole hasn't really gotten the message all throughout the different levels. So, you do still have suppliers, particularly those outside of the US, that use PFAS. We're still finding situations where food companies are finding that, they have unavoidable PFAS in their packaging. So it is still pretty common. This isn't an issue that's been solved by any stretch. So, Emily, you've been dealing with this, with others in the industry. What are you seeing?
So I take this question in kind of two parts. Is as it relates to food and beverage packaging, PFAS is still widely used, mostly because there has not been, outside of the two actions that FDA has taken, wide-scale prohibition or bans of them. PFAS have very good, provide very good packaging characteristics that we need for a large number of foods. As Seth mentioned, they're hydrophobic and lipophobic. So if your package is paper, and especially because over the last several years, maybe decade and a half, we've been moving towards sustainable packaging, which is pushing us more towards paper, paperboard, and fiber-based products, away from plastics to reduce plastic pollution, to where it appears that, truly, we got moved towards using PFAS more because of the types of packaging that we wanted to use. But now that we're having this phase out, we have to find better ways to make those plant-based products, as well as, potentially consider going back to recyclable plastic type products in order to meet those sustainability goals that we've been having. And then as it relates to specific PFAS as it's used, kind of in products, Seth mentioned, it's just in base materials due to its ubiquitous environmental, nature, as Leah discussed earlier, where it's in certain foods, kind of, again, not naturally, but just inherently in the food because of environmental contamination in the area where the food was grown or raised. And then additionally, because of the massive amount of use applications for PFAS, it's used in a number of consumer products. Yes, it is not intentionally present in, let's say, seafood, for example. It's just there because of environmental contamination. But as it relates to, shampoos or cosmetics, there is intentional use of PFAS, and those products have not been as much of the focus of state laws. Because again, as it relates to FDA regulation, those products, those ingredients have been found to, at least up until this point, safe and suitable for use in those applications, as it relates to how a company themselves have done those safety evaluations, since FDA doesn't do pre-market review of cosmetic ingredients. So we have another question. Would you recommend that a food producer do their own testing to check on the packaging supplier's claim? So I can tell you that my recommendation would be that is part of monitoring whatever your compliance programs are. I find it as a best practice. As we will discuss more next in 2 weeks, the reliability of testing may not be as good as we would hope or want, for packaging compliance and compliance with these laws. So it's not the only way to maintain compliance, but it is a good way to monitor whether or not you can actually rely upon the certifications that you've received from your suppliers. Seth, any extra thoughts?
Yeah, just going back to a point that I raised a lot. It's the frequency of your testing program is an important component, and how much you're relying on it, and essentially where are your suppliers located. Suppliers that are in the U.S. have a better understanding of the requirements for PFAS in the various states are going to be more reliable than companies that operate outside of the U.S. that maybe have different production processes that they'll rotate, or maybe they are a manufacturer that has various additional facilities that aren't identified that are supplying their products. So you could have variation from lot to lot depending on who your supplier is and what they're doing behind the scenes.
Yep. And our next question is, can you please talk a little bit more about the allowance of PFAS as a processing aid in plastic packaging? Have Vermont, Maine, or other states decided that there is a safer alternative for these? So one of the things to know about processing aids is that they can only be used in levels, necessary for their use, within good manufacturing practices, right? We don't use overages of amounts of any substance as it relates to processing. Otherwise there may be the potential of having a technical or functional effect in the finished product. As it relates to Maine, Vermont, truly Maine and Washington, which are the states that focus on the safer alternatives, this processing aid application is not covered by the law because it is not intentionally added as it relates to the state definition for intentionally added. So you don't need to identify safer alternatives for those applications in the packaging manufacturing process. However, in California, you need to make sure that any residual levels of a processing aid on the package is below that 100 ppm level. So no, you do not have to find a safer alternative in those applications. However, you do need to consider how that may contribute to the total PFAS content of your product as it relates to any food packaging that you are selling or providing in the state of California. So I believe that's all the questions that we have. And I mean, Seth, I don't think I have any more. Do you have any questions or thoughts on what else we should share?
No, just invite everyone to tune in at our part 2 session coming up.
All right. Well, with that, we'll close out. So thank you for joining us today. We hope this, phase 1 or step 1 or part 1 of our webinar was helpful information to you, as well as others within your organization. As a reminder, our next webinar session is same time, similar place on April 26th. So I believe that is noon Central Time. So feel free to register for that. And that's where we're going to be digging in a lot more as it relates to how to manage compliance with these laws, even though you got a little bit of a preview of that today. As a reminder, this program has been approved for legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with the recording of the webcast for your watching and sharing. Be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. This concludes our webinar. Thank you.